The smoke still hung in the air when Garrett Morrison realized that everything he had ever loved was gone, reduced to ash and silence in a single night that seemed to stretch into eternity. He stood in the remnants of what had been his home outside El Dorado, Kansas, watching the dawn break over the scorched earth where his wife Margaret and their two sons, 8-year-old Thomas and 5-year-old James, had perished in a fire that swept through their farmhouse with terrifying speed. It was June of 1873, and the drought had turned everything to kindling. But that knowledge brought no comfort as Garrett fell to his knees in the blackened dirt, his hands shaking as they touched the still warm debris that had once been the walls that sheltered his family's laughter and dreams. The neighbors had come running when they saw the orange glow against the night sky, but by the time anyone arrived, the structure was already collapsing, the heat so intense that no one could get close enough to help. Garrett had been in town, making a late delivery of cattle to the stockyards, a trip that usually would have taken him home by supper, but had run long when one of the steers broke loose and led him on a 2-hour chase through the outskirts of town. He had been cursing his bad luck as he finally rode home in the darkness, only to see the flames consuming everything he held dear from half a mile away. His horse had nearly thrown him as he spurted into a desperate gallop, but he was too late, always too late, and that fact carved itself into his soul like a brand. The funeral was held 3 days later in the small church at the edge of El Dorado, and Garrett stood beside 3 simple pine coffins without shedding a single tear, his face carved from stone, his eyes hollow and distant. The preacher spoke about God's plan and the comfort of heaven, but the words seemed to bounce off Garrett without penetrating, meaningless sounds in a world that had suddenly lost all sense. He was 32 years old, and he felt ancient, worn down to nothing but bone and the terrible knowledge that he would wake up every morning for the rest of his life, knowing he had failed to protect them. After the burial, people tried to speak to him, offering condolences and casseroles, but Garrett barely heard them. He rode back to what remained of his property and stood staring at the ruins, unable to make himself start cleaning up, unable to make himself do anything at all. The ranch hands he had employed had already left, knowing there was no work to be done here anymore, and Garrett was grateful for their absence. He did not want company. He did not want comfort. He wanted to disappear into the earth alongside his family. For 2 weeks, Garrett existed rather than lived. He slept on the ground near the ruins, refusing the offers from neighbors to stay in their homes. He ate almost nothing, drinking only when his body demanded it. His clothes became filthy, his beard grew wild, and his eyes took on a haunted quality that made people look away when they saw him in town on the rare occasions he rode in for supplies. He was wasting away, and somewhere deep inside, beneath the crushing weight of his grief, he knew it and did not care. It was on a scorching afternoon in late June when Prudence Baker found him collapsed near the creek that ran through the eastern edge of his property. She had been walking back from visiting a sick friend who lived beyond the Morrison place, and had decided to take the long way home through the cottonwoods that lined the water, seeking shade from the relentless sun. Prudence was 28 years old, a widow herself for the past year after her husband Samuel had been thrown from a horse and broken his neck, leaving her alone on their small homestead with nothing but debts and heartache. She knew what loss looked like, and when she saw the man lying face down in the dirt, his water canteen empty beside him, she recognized the shape of someone who had given up. She dismounted quickly, her dark blue dress dragging in the dust as she ran to him, her heart pounding. At first she thought he might be dead, but when she turned him over, she saw his chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. His face was burned by the sun, his lips cracked and bleeding. She uncorked her own canteen and dribbled water carefully over his mouth, supporting his head with her hand. His eyes fluttered open, unfocused and confused, and he tried to push her away weakly. "Leave me," Garrett croaked, his voice barely audible. "Just leave me be." "I will not," Prudence said firmly, her voice carrying a strength that surprised even her. "You are dying out here, and I will not stand by and watch another person give up on living." She managed to get him sitting upright, forcing him to take small sips of water, while his body shuddered with the effort of staying conscious. His clothes hung loosely on a frame that had clearly lost significant weight, and his eyes, when they finally focused on her face, carried such profound emptiness that Prudence felt her own throat tighten with emotion. "I know who you are," she said quietly. "You are Garrett Morrison. I was at the funeral for your family. I'm so very sorry for what happened." Something flickered in his expression, a spasm of pain that contorted his features before the blankness returned. "Then you know why I do not want to be saved." "I know why you think that," Prudence replied, helping him to his feet despite his weak protests. "But wanting to die and actually dying are two different things, and your body is fighting to live even if your heart is not. Come on, my wagon is just over there. I am taking you somewhere with shade and food." "I do not need your charity," Garrett said, but there was no strength behind the words, and he leaned heavily on her as she guided him toward her horse and small wagon. "This is not charity," Prudence said. "This is one human being helping another. You can hate me for it later if you want, but right now, you're coming with me." She managed to get him into the back of her wagon, where he immediately lay down, his eyes closing against the bright sun. Prudence climbed up to the driver's seat and clicked her tongue at her mare, steering them back toward the road that led to her homestead. She glanced back several times during the ride, half expecting him to roll out of the wagon and disappear into the brush, but he remained still, his breathing gradually becoming more regular. Prudence's home was a modest structure, a two-room cabin with a barn and chicken coop, surrounded by a vegetable garden that she tended herself. She had sold most of Samuel's cattle after his death to pay off debts, keeping only a milk cow and a few chickens. It was a lonely existence, but she had learned to find purpose in the daily routines, in the satisfaction of coaxing life from the soil and seeing her plants grow despite the harsh Kansas sun. She pulled the wagon up close to the cabin and helped Garrett inside, guiding him to the simple bed in the corner of the main room. He collapsed onto it without argument, his body finally surrendering to exhaustion. Prudence covered him with a light blanket and set about preparing some broth, something gentle that his stomach could handle after days of neglect. When Garrett woke hours later, the light had shifted to the golden amber of evening, and he found himself in an unfamiliar room. Panic seized him briefly before memory returned, and he sat up slowly, his head pounding. A woman appeared in the doorway, her brown hair pulled back in a practical bun, her face kind but marked by its own history of sorrow. She carried a bowl of broth and a piece of bread. "You are awake," Prudence said, setting the food on the small table beside the bed. "You need to eat something. Your body is dangerously weak." "Why did you bring me here?" Garrett asked, his voice still rough but stronger than before. "Because I found you dying, and I could not walk away," Prudence said simply. She sat down in the chair across from the bed, folding her hands in her lap. "When my husband died last year, I spent months wishing I could follow him. I understand what you are feeling, Mr. Morrison. I understand the weight of it." Garrett looked at her for a long moment, really seeing her for the first time. She had the kind of face that was made beautiful by character rather than perfect features, with intelligent gray eyes and a mouth that looked like it had once smiled easily. "If you understand, then you know that eating and living and continuing on feels like a betrayal of them." "I do know that," Prudence said softly. "I felt that every single day for 6 months. But then one morning I woke up and realized that Samuel would have been furious with me for wasting away. He loved life, even when it was hard, and he would have wanted me to keep finding reasons to wake up in the morning. I cannot speak for your wife, but I imagine she would feel the same about you." Garrett's jaw tightened, and for a moment, Prudence thought he might start shouting at her or storm out of the cabin. Instead, his shoulders slumped and he dropped his face into his hands. "I was not there. I should have been there, and I was not. I was chasing a stupid steer while they burned." "And if you had been there, you would have burned too," Prudence said quietly. "That is the truth you do not want to hear, but it is the truth nonetheless. You could not have saved them. The fire was too fast, too hot. The only difference would be that there would have been 4 graves instead of 3. "At least I would not have to live with this," Garrett said, his voice breaking for the first time since the fire. Prudence stood and walked to the window, looking out at her garden where tomato plants climbed their stakes and bean vines wound around poles. "The first few months are the worst. You wake up and forget for just a moment, and then you remember, and it is like being struck all over again. But slowly, very slowly, the moments between the pain get longer. You start to notice things again, like the way the light hits the leaves or the sound of rain on the roof. It does not mean you love them less. It just means you are learning to carry the weight instead of being crushed by it." She turned back to face him, her expression earnest. "I'm not asking you to be happy or to forget them, or to pretend any of this is acceptable. I am just asking you to eat something and stay alive for one more day. And then tomorrow, we will see about another day after that." Garrett stared at the bowl of broth, his stomach churning with hunger and revulsion. Finally, he reached for it with shaking hands and took a small sip. It was simple, just chicken and vegetables and salt, but it tasted like the first real thing he had experienced in weeks. He ate slowly, forcing himself to finish the bowl and half the bread, while Prudence sat quietly, not speaking, just being present. Over the next several days, a routine established itself. Garrett slept in the bed while Prudence made herself a pallet on the floor, though he protested this arrangement. She woke early each morning to tend her animals and garden, and she brought him food at regular intervals, insisting he eat even when he said he had no appetite. She did not press him to talk about his family, but she also did not pretend they had not existed. Sometimes she would mention her own husband, small memories that surfaced naturally, and Garrett found that it made it easier to occasionally share his own fragments of the past. "Thomas wanted to be a rancher like me," he said one afternoon as he sat on the porch, his strength slowly returning. "He used to follow me everywhere, asking 100 questions about the cattle and the horses and why the sky was blue." James was quieter, more like Margaret. He loved to draw pictures in the dirt with sticks. He once spent an entire afternoon making a drawing of our dog, getting every spot just right. Prudence nodded, her hands busy with mending a torn shirt. "What kind of dog?" "A mutt, mostly shepherd, I think. Her name was Belle. She died in the fire, too." Garrett's voice caught. "Everything died in that fire." "Tell me about Margaret," Prudence said gently. Garrett was quiet for so long that she thought he might not answer, but finally he spoke. "She had red hair, bright as a penny. When I met her, she was teaching school in Abilene, and I thought she was the most beautiful woman I had ever seen. She was smart, smarter than me, and she could make anything grow. Our garden used to be twice the size of yours, full of flowers and vegetables, and she knew the name of every plant. She sang while she worked, old songs her mother taught her." "She sounds wonderful," Prudence said, and she meant it. "She was," Garrett said, his voice thick with emotion. "They all were, and I should have been there." "You should have been lucky enough that the fire never happened," Prudence corrected. "But you were not there, and you cannot change that. What you can change is what you do now, with the life you still have." As July arrived and the heat intensified, Garrett began to help Prudence with the heavier chores around her homestead. At first, it was just small things, hauling water from the well or chopping wood for the stove. But gradually, he took on more tasks. He fixed the sagging door on her barn, replaced broken fence posts, and helped her harvest vegetables that were ready to be picked. The physical labor felt good in a way, a distraction that kept his hands busy and his mind from spiraling into the darkness that always lurked at the edges. He noticed things about Prudence as they worked side by side. She was stronger than she looked, capable of hard work without complaint. She had a gentle way with the animals, speaking to them softly as she milked the cow or collected eggs from the chickens. She hummed while she worked, not quite singing, but filling the silence with something that was not quite so heavy. And she never pushed him to be anything other than what he was in any given moment, whether that was silent and withdrawn or occasionally willing to share a memory or observation. One evening as they sat on the porch after supper, watching the sun paint the sky in shades of orange and purple, Prudence spoke quietly. "You do not have to stay here, you know. If you want to go back to your land, rebuild, try to make something of it again, I would understand." Garrett looked at her, surprised. "Are you telling me to leave?" "No," Prudence said quickly. "I am telling you that you are free to make whatever choice you need to make. You do not owe me anything, Garrett. I helped you because it was the right thing to do, not because I expected anything in return." Garrett considered this, turning his gaze back to the horizon. "I do not know if I can go back there. Every time I think about it, all I see is the fire. But I do not know what else to do either. I'm not the man I was before. I do not know who I am now." "None of us are who we were before the worst thing happened to us," Prudence said. "We are just who we become after, and that is something we build day by day." "Is that what you are doing?" Garrett asked. "Building who you are after Samuel?" Prudence nodded slowly. "I'm trying. Some days are better than others. I still talk to him sometimes when I'm out in the garden or doing tasks we used to do together. I tell him about my day, about the things I'm worried about or the small victories. It probably sounds foolish. It does not, Garrett said. I talk to Margaret too, and the boys. I tell them I am sorry, over and over. Maybe someday you will be able to tell them other things, Prudence said. Tell them about the good things you are doing, or the ways you are trying to honor their memory by living well. As the weeks passed, something shifted between Garrett and Prudence. It was subtle at first, just a growing comfort in each other's presence, an ease that came from shared grief and shared understanding. Garrett found himself looking forward to their evening conversations, to the way Prudence's face softened when she talked about things she cared about. He noticed the particular way she tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear when she was concentrating, and the sound of her rare laughter, which was like water in the desert. For her part, Prudence found herself drawn to Garrett's quiet strength, the way he had begun to return to life despite the weight he carried. She saw the man he had been in the careful way he handled tools, the knowledge he had about ranching and animals, the dry sense of humor that occasionally surfaced like a fish breaking the surface of still water. She respected the way he honored his family's memory without making a show of his grief, carrying it privately but allowing it to exist. It was in early August, on a day when the heat was so intense that even the grasshoppers seemed to move slowly, that something fundamental changed between them. They were working together to repair the fence around Prudence's vegetable garden, which had been damaged by a deer trying to get to the tomatoes. Garrett was holding a post steady while Prudence hammered it into place, and as she stepped back to check if it was straight, she lost her footing on the uneven ground. Garrett dropped the post and caught her before she could fall, his arms coming around her waist instinctively. For a moment, they stood frozen, closer than they had ever been, and Prudence felt her breath catch in her throat. She could feel the solid warmth of him, the strength in his arms, and when she looked up into his face, she saw something in his eyes that made her heart skip, a recognition and a longing that mirrored something she had been trying not to acknowledge in herself. "I am sorry," Garrett said, his voice rough, but he did not immediately let her go. "Do not be," Prudence whispered, and then she stepped back, her cheeks flushed with more than just the heat. They returned to their work in silence, but the air between them felt different, charged with possibility and confusion and the complicated reality of two people who had loved deeply and lost everything trying to figure out if they were allowed to feel something new. That night, Garrett lay awake on the bed in Prudence's cabin, his mind churning. He felt guilty for the way his heart had responded to holding Prudence, as if he were betraying Margaret's memory by feeling anything for another woman. But beneath the guilt was something else, something that felt like hope trying to push through frozen ground. He did not know if it was too soon or if there could ever be a right time, or if Prudence even felt the same uncertain pull that he did. In the other room, Prudence was equally sleepless, her thoughts tangled. She had not expected to feel anything like attraction again, had assumed that part of her life was over when Samuel died. But Garrett had awakened something in her, a reminder that she was still alive, still capable of connection. She did not know what to do with these feelings, whether to push them away or allow them space to exist. The next morning, they were both awkward around each other, overly polite and careful not to touch. But as the day wore on and the demands of work required cooperation, the awkwardness faded into something more natural. They were careful with each other, gentle, as if both of them understood that whatever was developing between them was fragile and needed protection. It was Garrett who finally broached the subject several days later as they sat on the porch after supper. The sun was setting, and fireflies were beginning to appear in the grass like tiny lanterns. He cleared his throat, his hands gripping his knees. "I need to say something, and I'm not sure how to say it properly." Prudence felt her heart begin to pound, but she kept her voice steady. "Then just say it plainly." "I feel something when I am around you," Garrett said, not looking at her, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "Something I did not expect to feel again, and I do not know if that is acceptable or terrible, or just the result of two broken people being near each other. But I needed to say it out loud because keeping it inside was making me feel like a liar." Prudence was quiet for a long moment, and Garrett risked a glance at her face. She was looking down at her hands, her expression unreadable. "I feel it too," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. And I do not know what it means either. I loved Samuel with everything I had, and you loved Margaret and your boys. How are we supposed to make sense of feeling something new when the old feelings have not gone away? I do not know, Garrett admitted, but I know that being near you makes the days feel less impossible. I know that I look forward to talking with you, to working beside you, to just existing in the same space, and I know that feels both right and wrong at the same time. Maybe it can be both, Prudence said slowly, finally looking up to meet his eyes. Maybe we are allowed to honor what we lost and still reach for something new. Maybe that is what surviving means. They sat in silence for a while, the weight of their admissions hanging in the air between them. Finally, Garrett reached out and took Prudence's hand, his rough palm warm against hers. She did not pull away. They sat like that until full darkness fell, their hands linked, two people trying to find their way out of grief and into something that might, eventually, resemble hope. Over the following weeks, their relationship deepened carefully. They held hands sometimes in the evenings. They stood closer when they worked together. Once, when Prudence cut her hand on a piece of metal while working in the barn, Garrett cleaned and bandaged it with such tenderness that she felt tears spring to her eyes, not from pain, but from the realization of how long it had been since someone had cared for her that way. They talked more openly about their lost loved ones, sharing stories and memories without fear of judgment or the expectation that they should be moving on. Garrett told Prudence about the day Thomas was born, how he had paced outside the house for hours while the midwife attended to Margaret, how he had cried when he finally held his son for the first time. Prudence told Garrett about Samuel's proposal, how he had asked her while they were walking by the river, how he had been so nervous that he dropped the ring and they both had to search through the grass to find it, laughing the whole time. It does not feel like betraying them, Prudence said one evening, talking about them with you. It feels like keeping them alive in a way. I was afraid you would think I was being disloyal, Garrett admitted, letting myself care for you while Margaret has only been gone a few months. I do not think there is a timeline for the heart, Prudence said. I think we feel what we feel, and we can either fight it or accept it. Fighting it does not seem to honor anyone's memory. It just makes us miserable. In September, Garrett finally rode out to his old property, Prudence accompanying him at his request. They stood together looking at the ruins, which had been partially cleared by some of the neighbors who had felt bad about Garrett's isolation. The land itself was still good, the pastures where he had run cattle still viable, the creek still ran clean. It was just the house and barn that were gone, reduced to ash and memory. I could rebuild, Garrett said quietly. The land is still mine. I could start over. You could, Prudence agreed. Is that what you want? Garrett was quiet for a long time, his hand finding hers. I think what I want is to build something new, not try to recreate what was. This place will always be where they died. I do not think I can make a life here, not a real one. It would just be me living in a graveyard. What would building something new look like? Prudence asked carefully. Garrett turned to face her, his expression serious and hopeful at the same time. I have been thinking about it a lot. I could sell this land. It is good property, close to town. I would get a fair price for it. And then I could use that money to expand your homestead, buy some cattle, build onto the cabin so it is bigger, make it a real ranch again, something we could work together. Prudence felt her breath catch. We? If you wanted that, Garrett said quickly. I am not presuming anything, Prudence. I'm just saying that when I imagine a future now, when I let myself imagine one, you are in it. And I know it is fast, and I know we are both still healing, but I also know that I do not want to waste time being afraid of feeling something good just because I have felt something terrible. Prudence felt tears sliding down her cheeks, but they were not entirely sad tears. I want that too. I have been so afraid to say it, afraid that it was too soon, or that I was dishonoring Samuel's memory, or that you did not really feel the same way. But yes, Garrett, I want to build something new with you. Garrett pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly, and Prudence wrapped her arms around him, feeling the solid reality of him, the life and warmth. They stood like that for a long time, two people who had been broken, finding wholeness in each other. The practical matters were settled over the next several weeks. Garrett put his property up for sale and found a buyer quickly, a rancher from Wichita who was looking to expand his operations. The price was fair, giving Garrett enough money to make real improvements to Prudence's homestead and purchase a small herd of cattle to start building a ranch. But before any of that could happen, there was a more important question to settle. It was in late September, on an evening when the heat had finally broken and there was a hint of autumn in the air, that Garrett took Prudence's hand and led her out to the garden she loved so much. The vegetables were finishing their season, the tomato plants heavy with fruit, the squash vines sprawling across the ground. "I need to ask you something," Garrett said, his voice nervous in a way she rarely heard. "And I want you to know that you can say no, that there is no pressure, that I will understand if it is too much or too soon." Prudence felt her heart begin to race. "Ask me." Garrett took both her hands in his, looking into her eyes with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Prudence Baker, I know that we have both loved and lost. I know that neither of us expected to find this, whatever this is between us. But I know that I love you, that I love your strength and your kindness and the way you saved my life when I had given up on living. I know that I want to spend whatever time I have left on this earth building a life with you, honoring what we have lost by living fully and well. Will you marry me?" Prudence felt the tears come again, but she was smiling through them, her heart so full it felt like it might burst. "Yes. Yes, Garrett, I will marry you. I love you too, and I want to build that life with you, all of it." Garrett kissed her then, their first real kiss, and it was sweet and gentle and full of promise. When they finally pulled apart, both of them were crying and laughing at the same time, the complicated joy of two people who had survived the worst and found their way to something beautiful. They were married in early October in the same small church where Garrett had buried his family, and while some people in town whispered that it was too soon, that it was indecent somehow, most understood that grief did not follow a schedule, and the two people who had suffered such losses deserved whatever happiness they could find. Prudence wore a simple dress of cream-colored cotton, and Garrett wore his best suit, cleaned and pressed. The preacher who had spoken at the funerals now spoke words of joining and commitment, and when Garrett and Prudence exchanged their vows, there was not a dry eye in the small congregation. They spent their wedding night in the cabin that was now truly theirs together, and it was tender and careful and full of the kind of love that comes from truly seeing another person's wounds and choosing to love them anyway. Neither of them tried to pretend that their first loves did not exist or that the losses they had suffered had not shaped them. Instead, they brought all of who they were, broken and healing and hopeful, into their union. The work of building their life together began immediately. Garrett used the money from his land sale to add 2 more rooms to the cabin, making it large enough for a real family home. He built a proper barn to house the cattle he purchased, 15 head of good stock that would form the foundation of their herd. He repaired and expanded the fences, turning Prudence's small homestead into a working ranch. Prudence continued to manage the garden and the chickens, but now she also helped with the cattle, learning the rhythms of ranch life under Garrett's patient instruction. They worked hard, from dawn until dusk most days, but they also made time for each other, for quiet conversations on the porch and shared meals and the simple pleasure of falling asleep beside someone who understood. Garrett still had days when the grief crashed over him like a wave, when he would wake from nightmares of fire and find himself unable to speak. On those days, Prudence did not try to fix him or tell him to move on. She just sat with him, held him if he wanted to be held, and let him feel what he needed to feel. Similarly, when Prudence had days when she missed Samuel so much it physically hurt, when she found herself crying over some small thing that reminded her of him, Garrett did not feel threatened or inadequate. He understood that love did not disappear just because a person died, and that Prudence's capacity to still love Samuel did not diminish what she felt for him. Winter came to Kansas with cold winds and occasional snow, and Garrett and Prudence spent the long evenings by the fire, reading together or planning for the spring. They talked about the future in ways that felt both terrifying and exciting. They wanted to grow the ranch, build it into something sustainable and profitable. They wanted to be part of the community, to help their neighbors and be helped in turn. And eventually, when Prudence said it out loud one night in early December, they wanted children. "I do not know if I am ready," Garrett admitted, his hand resting on her knee. The thought of having children again terrifies me. What if something happens? What if I fail to protect them the way I failed to protect Thomas and James? You did not fail them, Prudence said firmly, a conversation they had had before, but one that Garrett still struggled to believe. A terrible accident happened. But I understand the fear, Garrett. I am afraid, too. I'm afraid that wanting children means I am trying to replace Samuel, or that I will love them too much and lose them and not survive it. But I am also afraid that letting fear rule our lives means we are not really living at all. You are wiser than I am, Garrett said, pulling her close. I am just as scared as you are, Prudence corrected. I am just choosing to be scared and hopeful at the same time. Spring arrived in 1874 with rain and new growth, and the ranch began to truly flourish. The cattle thrived on the good grass, and Garrett was able to sell several head at a profit that allowed him to purchase more. Prudence's garden exploded with vegetables, and she began selling the surplus at the market in El Dorado, earning money that she carefully saved in a tin in the kitchen. They hired a young man named Charlie to help with the heavier ranch work, and his presence made it possible for them to accomplish even more. It was in late spring when Prudence realized she was pregnant. She had suspected for a few weeks, but had not wanted to say anything until she was certain. When she finally told Garrett, standing in the barn after supper, his reaction was everything she had hoped for and feared. He looked terrified and overjoyed at the same time, his eyes filling with tears as he placed his hand gently on her still flat belly. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice shaking. "I am sure," Prudence said, covering his hand with hers. "Are you happy?" "I am terrified," Garrett admitted. "But yes, I'm happy. I am so happy, Prudence, and I'm so scared." "Me too," she said, both things at once. They held each other in the barn as the light faded outside. Two people who had lost everything finding the courage to hope again. The pregnancy was not easy. Prudence suffered from nausea in the early months and exhaustion throughout. Garrett was attentive to the point of being overprotective, constantly worried that she was working too hard or doing something that might harm the baby. They argued about it sometimes, Prudence insisting that she was not fragile, and Garrett unable to silence the voice of fear that whispered constantly about all the things that could go wrong. But as the months passed and Prudence's belly grew round and solid, some of Garrett's fear eased, replaced by a tentative excitement. He built a cradle from wood he carefully selected and sanded smooth, working on it in the evenings with a concentration that Prudence found touching. She sewed baby clothes from fabric she bought in town, tiny gowns and blankets, letting herself imagine holding their child. They talked about names carefully. Garrett did not want to use Thomas or James, feeling that it would be trying to replace his sons rather than honoring them. Prudence agreed, suggesting instead that if they had a boy, they name him after her father, Patrick, and if they had a girl, they choose a name together that felt right. They settled on Grace if it was a girl, agreeing that Grace was something they had both been given when they needed it most. The baby was born in early December of 1874, after a long labor that left Prudence exhausted and Garrett nearly out of his mind with worry. The midwife from town, a capable woman named Mrs. Henderson, handled everything with calm efficiency. But Garrett still paced outside for hours, remembering another birth and the joy that had followed, unable to stop his mind from imagining all the ways this could end in tragedy. But when Mrs. Henderson finally opened the door and told him he had a son and that both mother and baby were healthy, Garrett felt his knees go weak with relief. He walked into the room on shaking legs and found Prudence propped up in bed, exhausted but radiant, holding a tiny bundle wrapped in one of the blankets she had made. She looked up at him with tears streaming down her face, and when she pulled back the blanket to show him their son, Garrett felt his heart crack open in a way that was both painful and beautiful. The baby had a shock of dark hair and eyes that were still unfocused, and tiny, perfect hands that gripped Garrett's finger when he offered it. "Patrick," Prudence said softly. "Patrick Morrison. Do you like it?" "I love it," Garrett said, his voice breaking. "He is perfect. You are perfect. I cannot believe we get to have this." He sat carefully on the edge of the bed, and Prudence shifted so he could hold Patrick. Garrett took his son with trembling hands, holding him like he was made of glass, and felt tears streaming down his face. It was joy and terror and grief all mixed together, remembering the sons he had lost while holding the son who was here, alive and real and his. "I'm going to do everything I can to keep you safe," Garrett whispered to Patrick. "I'm going to be the father you deserve, and I'm going to tell you about your brothers, about Thomas and James, so you know that you are part of something bigger than just us." Prudence reached out and took Garrett's hand, squeezing it gently. "We are going to be good parents," she said, "together. And we are going to let ourselves love him completely, even though it is scary." The first few months of Patrick's life were exhausting and wonderful. He was a healthy baby, hungry and loud when he wanted something, but content when his needs were met. Garrett was attentive in ways that surprised even him, changing diapers and walking the floor with Patrick when he was fussy and singing nonsense songs that made Prudence laugh. He was still sometimes gripped by fear, still sometimes woke in the night in a panic to make sure Patrick was breathing, but the fear was gradually being balanced by the reality of daily life, of watching his son grow and change. Prudence recovered slowly from the birth, but found joy in nursing Patrick and watching Garrett become a father again. She saw him healing in ways that talk could not accomplish, saw him learning to trust in the future and believe that good things could last. She healed too, finding that motherhood was different than she had imagined, but no less profound, that loving Patrick did not diminish her love for Samuel, but existed alongside it. As 1875 unfolded, the ranch continued to prosper. The cattle herd grew, and Garrett was able to hire another hand, which gave him more time to spend with his family. Patrick grew from a tiny infant into a baby who smiled and laughed and eventually began to crawl, getting into everything and keeping his parents constantly alert. Prudence's garden flourished, and she began selling not just vegetables, but also preserves and pickles that became popular at the El Dorado market. They made friends in town, becoming part of the community in ways that felt natural and right. People stopped whispering about how quickly they had married and instead saw them for what they were, two people who had survived tragedy and built something beautiful from the ashes. Garrett and Prudence were invited to church socials and barn raisings, and they hosted gatherings at their ranch, their home becoming known for its warmth and hospitality. On the anniversary of the fire, in June of 1875, Garrett and Prudence took Patrick and rode out to the small cemetery where Thomas, James, and Margaret were buried. Garrett had not been back since the funeral, unable to face it, but with Prudence beside him and Patrick in his arms, he felt strong enough to try. They stood together at the graves, which were well maintained, the grass kept short by the church volunteers. "I want you to meet someone," Garrett said softly to the graves, his voice thick with emotion. "This is Patrick, your brother and your son. He is beautiful and strong and loved so much. And this is Prudence, who saved my life and gave me a reason to keep living. I miss you every single day. I still talk to you, Margaret, tell you about what I am doing and what I am feeling. And I tell Thomas and James stories about the ranch and about their new brother. I hope that wherever you are, you know that I loved you with everything I had. And I hope you understand that I have found a way to love again, not because you were not enough, but because Prudence helped me remember that I was still alive, and that life is a gift, even when it is hard." Prudence stood quietly beside him, her hand on his back, letting him have this moment. When he finished speaking, she leaned down and placed a small bouquet of wildflowers on Margaret's grave. "Thank you for loving him," she said simply. "Thank you for giving him the sons he treasures, and for being the kind of woman who would want him to be happy. I promise to take care of him and honor your memory by living well." They stood there for a long time, the three of them, a family built from loss and love and the courage to keep trying. When they finally rode home, Garrett felt something loosen in his chest, a knot of pain that had been there since the fire finally beginning to untangle. It would never disappear completely, he knew that, but it no longer felt like it would destroy him. As Patrick grew into a toddler, the ranch grew with him. By 1876, they had expanded their herd to over 50 head of cattle and had built a second barn. Prudence had hired a young woman from town to help with the housework in the garden, which gave her more time to spend with Patrick and to help Garrett with the ranch management. They were prospering in ways that felt both earned and blessed, the result of hard work and mutual support and the determination to build something lasting. It was in the spring of 1877 when Prudence discovered she was pregnant again. Patrick was 2.5, a sturdy little boy with his mother's gray eyes and his father's dark hair, full of curiosity and energy. The pregnancy was easier this time, perhaps because Prudence knew what to expect, and Garrett was less paralyzed by fear, having learned that love did not guarantee loss, that sometimes things turned out well. Their second child, a daughter, was born in early December of 1877, exactly 3 years after Patrick. They named her Grace, and she was tiny and delicate with wispy blonde hair that surprised them both. Garrett held her with the same careful reverence he had held Patrick, but with less fear this time, more confidence that he could be a good father. "We are a family," Prudence said softly, lying in bed with Grace nursing at her breast and Patrick cuddled against her side, Garrett sitting beside them. "A real family." "We are," Garrett agreed, his arm around his wife, his eyes on his children. "I never thought I would have this again. I never thought I would want to have this again. But I am so grateful that I do." The years that followed were good ones, marked by the normal challenges of raising children and running a ranch, but also by love and laughter, and the deep satisfaction of work well done. Patrick grew into a boy who loved the ranch as much as his father, following Garrett around and learning everything he could about cattle and horses. Grace was quieter, more like her mother, content to play in the garden or sit beside Prudence as she worked on her sewing. Garrett told his children stories about their brothers and about their first mother, wanting them to know that they were part of a history that included loss. "You had brothers named Thomas and James," he told Patrick one night as he tucked him into bed. "They died before you were born, in a fire, and they would have loved you so much. You remind me of Thomas sometimes, the way you ask questions about everything." "Do you miss them?" Patrick asked, his young face serious. "Every day," Garrett said honestly. "But missing them does not mean I am sad all the time. It just means they were important to me, and I keep them in my heart. Just like I keep you in my heart, and Grace and your mother." "Can you love lots of people at the same time?" Patrick asked. "You can," Garrett said, smoothing his son's hair back from his forehead. "The heart is big enough for all of it, all the love and all the missing. That is what I have learned." By 1880, the ranch was one of the most successful in the area, and Garrett and Prudence were well respected in the community. They had survived loss that would have destroyed many people, and had built not just a life, but a thriving, joyful existence. Their home was always full of noise and activity, children running through the rooms, the smell of Prudence's cooking filling the kitchen, the sound of Garrett's voice as he sang while working in the barn. In the spring of 1881, Prudence became pregnant again. The surprise as they had assumed their family was complete. She was 36 now, and while she worried about the risks of pregnancy at her age, she also felt a deep excitement. The baby, another boy, was born in late December, and they named him Samuel after Prudence's first husband, feeling that it was right to honor him in this way. Garrett held little Samuel and felt nothing but love, no jealousy or insecurity about the name. He understood that Prudence's heart was big enough for all of them, for the husband she had lost and the husband she had found, for all the children living and dead. "Hello, Samuel," he whispered to his son. "You are named after a good man, someone your mother loved very much. That is a fine legacy to carry." As the children grew, the ranch grew with them. Patrick showed an aptitude for working with horses that delighted Garrett, and by the time he was 10, he was helping to break and train the horses they used for cattle work. Grace developed a talent for drawing, sketching pictures of the animals and the landscape that were surprisingly good, reminding Garrett painfully and wonderfully of James. Samuel was still too young to show clear interests, but he was a happy child, quick to laugh and eager to follow his older siblings wherever they went. Garrett and Prudence watched their children grow with a mixture of pride and the poignant awareness of how quickly time passed. They still had hard days, days when grief caught them by surprise or when fear tried to creep back in. But those days were fewer now, balanced by the overwhelming reality of the life they had built, the love they had created. On a warm evening in June of 1885, 12 years after the fire that had taken everything, Garrett and Prudence sat on their porch watching their children play in the yard. Patrick, now 10, was showing Grace, 7, how to rope a fence post, while Samuel, 3, toddled around them laughing. The sun was setting in shades of gold and amber, and from where they sat they could see the cattle grazing in the distant pastures, the garden full of growing things, the barn solid and well-built. "Do you ever think about how different things could have been?" Prudence asked, her hand in Garrett's. "All the time," Garrett said honestly. "I think about the life I had before, and I miss it. I will always miss Margaret and Thomas and James, but I also know that if you had not found me that day by the creek, I would not be here. I would not have this life, these children, this love, and I cannot wish away any of it." "I feel the same about Samuel," Prudence said. "I loved him, and I will always carry that love, but I also love you, and I love our life together. I do not think we have to choose between honoring what we lost and celebrating what we have found." "We are lucky," Garrett said, pulling her close, "not because we did not suffer. We did terribly, but because we found each other in the suffering, and we helped each other remember how to live." As the light faded and the children's laughter filled the air, Garrett Morrison felt something he had not imagined possible on that terrible night in 1873 when everything burned. He felt peace. Not the peace of forgetting or moving on, but the peace of integration, of carrying loss and love together, of honoring the past while building the future. Prudence had saved his life, but more than that, she had helped him find a reason to keep living, and together they had created something beautiful from the ashes of their grief. The ranch continued to prosper over the years that followed. Patrick took on more and more responsibility as he grew into a young man, eventually becoming Garrett's full partner in running the cattle operation. Grace married a young teacher from El Dorado when she was 20, and they settled on a small farm nearby, close enough for regular visits. Samuel showed an interest in law and went away to study, though he returned home often, always happy to be back on the ranch where he had grown up. Garrett and Prudence grew older together, their hair graying, their bodies slowing down, but their love only deepening with time. They had built a legacy not just of land and cattle, but of family, of showing their children that it was possible to survive terrible loss and still choose life, still choose love. They told stories about Margaret and Samuel, about Thomas and James, keeping those memories alive so that the children growing up knew they were part of a history that included sorrow but was not defined by it. On their 20th wedding anniversary in October of 1894, Patrick, Grace, and Samuel threw their parents a party at the ranch. Friends and neighbors came from all over, filling the house and yard with celebration. There was music and dancing and food and speeches that made both Garrett and Prudence tear up. As Garrett stood with his arm around his wife, surrounded by their children and grandchildren, by the community they had become part of, he felt overwhelming gratitude for the unlikely path that had brought him here. "Thank you," he said to Prudence, kissing her temple, not caring who saw. "Thank you for finding me. Thank you for refusing to let me give up. Thank you for this life. Thank you for being brave enough to love again," Prudence replied, squeezing his hand. "Thank you for building this with me." They danced that night under the stars, moving slowly to music played by a fiddler from town, two people who had lost everything and found each other in the ruins. They had not forgotten what they had lost, would never forget, but they had learned to carry that loss alongside joy, to let both exist in the same heart. As the night grew late and the guests began to depart, Garrett and Prudence stood on their porch, watching the lanterns bobbing away into the darkness. The ranch was quiet now, except for the familiar sounds of animals settling for the night and the wind moving through the cottonwoods. They stood together as they had stood so many times before, their hands linked, their hearts full. "I would not change any of it," Garrett said suddenly. "Even knowing the pain that came before, even knowing what I lost, I would not change it because it brought me here, to you, to this life." "Neither would I," Prudence said, leaning her head against his shoulder. "We have been blessed, Garrett, not because we did not suffer, but because we learned what we were capable of surviving and what we were capable of building." They went inside together, to the home they had made, to the bed they had shared for 20 years, to the life they had chosen despite every reason to give up. And as they lay in the darkness, Garrett thought about the man he had been on that terrible night in 1873, broken and wanting to die, and the man he was now, full of years and love and purpose. The journey between those two men had been long and painful and full of grace. The fire had taken everything, but it had not taken his capacity to love again, to hope again, to build again. Prudence had shown him that, had saved him not with grand gestures, but with daily presence, with the patient insistence that he was worth saving, that life was worth living even after loss. And together, they had created something lasting, a family and a home, and a love story that began in grief, but ended in joy. As sleep claimed him, Garrett's last conscious thought was of gratitude, deep and abiding, for the widow who had helped him find a reason to keep living, and for the life they had built together in the wild Kansas landscape, a life that honored what had been lost by being lived fully and well. They had survived the worst, and they had chosen to keep going, and that choice had made all the difference.